Coming up next on America's Hope, we're going to be talking about post-Iowa caucuses and then what it means for New Hampshire and beyond. We'll break it all down with Denise Gsum, as well as Timothy Allen Simon and pollster Stefan Henen. Join us for a great discussion on presidential politics. So welcome to America's Hope. And now that former President Trump has won the Republican Iowa caucuses handedly, now on to New Hampshire. It's one for the history books, you could say, because Donald Trump trounces his competitors, winning 51% of the vote in the Republican Iowa caucuses. But two challengers, Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley, remain, and they're vowing to move on to the next challenge as well. Meantime, President Biden is making it clear to his supporters that he believes the election will come down to this, a fight between he and Donald Trump and what Mr. Biden calls, quote unquote, extreme MAGA Republicans. So here we are to discuss all of the political ramifications and prognostications from Iowa and beyond. At the same time, even in the midst of our divided politics, we'll seek some common ground to keep our focus on what really matters to America: hope. Hope must prevail. Denise Gsum joins us now, and she is a political analyst. Interesting thing about Denise, she was born at Travis Air Force Base in Northern California to a Chinese mother and a Canadian father. She knows and loves America. And as the daughter of immigrants and a lover of God, her life is marked by gratitude and a commitment to public service. She has served in the Bush administration, and she has written a book about politics for people who hate politics like me. Denise, good to have you on this hour. Thank you for joining.
It is so
America's
great
Hope.
to be with you. Thank you so much, Kelly. I love that intro.
Yeah, well,
As
there are
we
so
giggle
many.
about politics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, look, politically, what happened in Iowa was totally expected. Trump did not disappoint, and his base did not disappoint. They came out in the frigid, cold temperatures, -0 temperatures, to actually vote for the man they want to see back in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
What do you think motivated them?
Well, clearly there were no Californians out there like me, because none of us would have made it past the front door. We're just a little too weak. And those Midwesterners are hardy, and they're committed, and their enthusiasm for the former president is sky high. When you look at the difference between, and I only know this for Biden versus Trump, not, Trump compared to DeSantis and Haley, but enthusiasm was about 3 out of 10, I think, on average for Biden. I saw a poll recently about that. And there was, I think, 8 out of 10 Trump supporters were a 10 out of 10. It was like gauging how excited people were. And that's the only thing that I can imagine that would compel somebody to go out in those sub-zero temperatures and show up for the person they really think is going to save America. And I think that's really what's at stake. That's what you're feeling in the electorate. Is it feels like an existential fight for many Americans. And it's the only thing that can explain it, I think.
To that end, for those who feel that Trump is the answer to save America, there are those on the other side who are basically saying that Trump would not save America, but would hurt America. From that perspective, what do you say to the detractors who say, no, be careful, because Mr. Trump and MAGA Republicans may hurt this country, whereas they believe Joe Biden in some way will help this country, even though Joe Biden has poor approval ratings?
Well, you and I both know the only person that can save America, and it's neither a candidate. In fact, the government can never save us from anything. God saves us from everything, and he protects us. And so I think anytime we have an electorate that, however, that feels that way, that really feels like the onus of responsibility to protect our way of life, whether you're on the left or the right, it rests on a government and a leader. You start seeing the sort of the division that you're seeing in America is compelled and furthered because of that sense that if we don't do something and this person isn't in, then our way of life as we know it is over. I think it's a very dangerous perspective to have because A, it isn't true. That's not the real truth of our reality in America, but it's also, or for any country, honestly. But at the same time, it is how many people feel. And that's why I think this election is going to see just record breaking turnout, at least on the right, because of what we've seen with Biden over the last 3.5 years and how much Republicans are dying for a change in leadership and many independents as well.
And and is Donald Trump the one who can do it? I mean, you and I just talked about the fact that
Yeah,
only one person can do that, and that's God Himself. But nevertheless, we still have a government to run.
that's right. Well, clearly they're not looking for a fresh start because they're going back to a former president. And neither party had an appetite to change horses midstream in what feels like it's an ongoing battle of tug of war. And so I think what people want is the last best thing that they had. That's what I'm sensing. All the words and the forward thinking, sort of younger generation talk that we have seen from DeSantis and Ramaswamy and from Nikki Haley, making the case for why we should have new forward thinking leadership, has clearly been rejected by the voters. I think the voters feel like they want somebody who can restore order. We just don't feel safe as a nation. And so I think that chaos is something that people want to eliminate. And even though Trump is a chaotic president and has been a chaotic candidate, there's some kind of order that he promises to those voters that are supporting him that they want back.
Look, I'm talking to Denise Gsum. She is a political analyst as well as an attorney and the author of a great book, Politics for People Who Hate Politics. So we're going to come back and really go a little bit deeper in what Americans are looking for at this particular time with this 2024 presidential campaign that's unfolded. Welcome back to America's Hope. I'm Kelly Wright, and the beautiful lady you see on the screen right there is Denise Gsum. She is a political analyst. She has worked with the Bush administration. She knows a thing or two about politics as well. She's an attorney, or lawyer, I should say, in terms of studying law, and then, of course, she has studied politics. When you worked with the Bush administration, was it anything near the chaos and the chaotic activity that we see in today's time, bearing in mind that President George W. Bush had to wage war against the axis of evil,
Yeah.
most notably against terrorism?
Just the fact that you asked the question the way you did, knowing what we endured in our first year in the White House when I was with President Bush with 9/11 and all the challenges that came with that. Um, it's funny. It almost feels like it was, maybe I'm just being nostalgic, but it feels like it was almost more orderly because the chaos came from outside rather than from within. And I feel like the chaos that we experience now as Americans is something that we're both perpetuating, but also that we're causing. A lot of the chaos that you're seeing in Congress, for example, with the change in speaker leadership and the potential looming shutdown of the federal government. It's always, something that's being considered. It doesn't seem like anyone's really a grown up in the room. And I think that's before, when I worked for President Bush, it felt like there was a sense of decorum and or civility that people could overcome their personal feelings about the president and how he got into office, after 2 Florida recounts and the Supreme Court deciding that he was president, and really say, let's unite, because when we had a common enemy, we were able to come together. I mean, you and I both saw, all the incredible things that were happening in places like New York City, where they were clapping for this president they never voted for. And yet we felt a love for one another. And I think that love, that sense of charity, that grace that we extend to people on other sides of the aisle has really eroded. And the division is at an all-time high.
To that end, how do we get through the malaise that we have inflicted upon ourselves as one nation divided rather than being
Right.
united?
Well, as the Bible says, a house divided cannot stand. And of course, Abraham Lincoln repeated that when he was presiding over a civil war. And it's still true today. Those are eternal truths. And so, as Americans, we really have to sit back and say, yes, I understand that we're going to go after what we believe in this election season. But our identity as Americans, and for me and you, both of us, and for many other Americans, as children of God, first and foremost, that are called to love one another, including our enemies, not just our neighbors, but our enemies, that has to transcend the divisions and the differences that we feel politically. If we're not able to get to a point in the very near future where we see our survival is being dependent on one another, loving each other well, or at least honoring and respecting each other, we're not going to have an America that we can stand behind. And all the blessings that my parents came from other countries to experience and to give me a chance at life in here in America are not going to exist anymore because we will have taken them away from ourselves.
You know, you're the daughter of immigrants who came to this
Mm-hmm.
country because they believed in the American dream and they believed in the hope that
Right.
this dream provides and this country provides. To that end, immigration is a hot issue, as you know. We see what's happening on the
Yes.
southern border. We see how it's manifested itself and the trouble that it's caused in major cities like Chicago and New York City, how they're dealing with the immigrant issue now that it's being visited upon them, albeit through the governor of Texas
Yes.
and at one point even the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis. What do you say about the immigration issue? What has to be done? What should be done?
Immigration is such a broad term because it encompasses, and depending on who uses it, everyone has sort of a different definition of what matters to them in regards to the immigration issue. We have one issue of border security, which to me feels like a national security issue, much less so than an immigration policy issue. This is just a matter of ensuring that Americans are safe. And that requires doing exactly what every president has always done, which is maintaining a physical structure that can protect them from anyone who'd want to jump, the fence at the White House, which people try to do all the time, and deter people from coming into a place where it would endanger the president and in the southern border, our country and the citizens who live there on that border. And so, having spent 10 years of my life in San Diego, I ran for Congress in San Diego. I have a lot of friends who are Border Patrol agents. I have a lot of friends whose spouses are Border Patrol agents. And I was actually endorsed by the National Border Patrol Union. So I got to spend a lot of time with them along the border. And I think what people are feeling, whether they're in a border state or not, is that the rules are no longer being followed. I mean, there are laws in place with regard to immigration, and many people are trying to jump the line by coming in illegally. And I think it's people like my parents and many of my friends who are Mexican American who say, this is so unfair. We've had friends and family members who've come and followed all the rules to earn the privilege of becoming an American citizen. And now we have a president who's basically giving amnesty to everyone who comes in, whether you want to call it that or something else.
The other issue that's going on out there is the issue with national security as I understand it, through geopolitical things that are happening,
Sure.
or even war that's going on in the Middle East. When you look at what's happening with Israel and Hamas and the tentacles
Mm.
of Iran being involved there, Ukraine and Russia, and then just most recently, the attack on a U.S. Shipping vessel, the Gibraltar
Right.
Eagle. Fortunately, that ship incurred no damage and there were no injuries. But the Houthi rebels of Yemen had the gall to actually open fire on a U.S. shipping vessel. What does that say about the administration and its, carry a big stick is what I'm reminded of with Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Are we carrying a big stick?
I think we tossed that stick a long time ago. I mean, the problem with America is in our leadership at the moment is that whether you look back at Biden when he drew the red line with Syria and he said, we're not going to allow them to go any further. And then he just allowed them to continue to kill their own people
I mean,
mercilessly
Obama,
using
President Obama.
Obama. Sorry,
Yeah.
yeah. If I said anyone else that was wrong, it was Obama. Yeah. So looking back to then, when we started our national standing, when we couldn't stand behind many of our allies, I think a lot of that nationalistic, populist sentiment that exists sort of on both sides of the aisles in different ways, but is largely associated with the Ramaswamis and Trump supporters, where they're saying America first. There's a sense that America is no longer interested in being part of the global conversation. And this is one of the areas where I think Nikki Haley ended up coming out ahead of Donald Trump on with respect to the foreign policy issue. Um, I think she was at 45% with the Iowa caucus goers compared to Donald Trump's 36-ish%, I believe, in terms of where she stood, just how much they liked her foreign policy perspective. Because one thing that we have to recognize is that if we're not handling those threats on foreign lands, those threats to come to us in America. And that's what we saw on 9/11. And that's something I'll never forget, being a White House staffer and realizing that our nation was under attack. And so I'm not saying that we need to be a global policeman or engage in nation building the way we tried to in Iraq and Afghanistan and failed. But there's got to be some middle ground where we recognize that if we're not engaging on these real big issues, and just even watching the recent Taiwanese election for president and seeing China's interference in that election, that's really the sort of biggest dog in the fight that we have to, I think, Republicans and Democrats agree on, is China's the biggest threat to us in the long term. All of these other conflicts that are happening are also important because the geopolitical system is such that we're all interconnected regardless of whether we want to be or not.
Very well said. And then, of course, there's the economy. The economy.
Oh, yes. James Carville was so smart when he said it's the economy, stupid. If only everyone would take his advice to heart. He's one of the winningest, strategists, regardless of whether you agree with him in his politics. And I think it's always good to learn from anyone who's smart and is able to just succinctly point to what the issue is and hammer it home. I think all of this conversation we've been seeing in the GOP primary, where people, with the debates and talking about any issue other than the economy, was a complete waste of time. While all of those GOP candidates were on stage arguing about things, all kinds of issues, Donald Trump was out talking about two things. First and foremost, the economy, and second, immigration and border security. And he doesn't waste any time. He just gets straight to the heart of the people. And people are feeling so just sort of kicked in the shins by the economy right now. We had record generational, once in a generation inflation last summer. And for the Biden administration, for its part, has been gaslighting Americans, saying things are getting so much better. Can't you tell? Why don't you believe it? You silly people. And none of my friends back in California feel like things are getting better. If anything, they feel like they're still frozen out of a housing market, and they can't buy a car, and they can't afford groceries the way they want to, and they can't go out to eat anymore. So I think there's just a real lack of resonance with the American people with regard to what Biden's saying, and Trump sees that, and he's so smart in seizing on that and running with it, because that's going to determine the outcome of this election.
So, Denise, in determining the outcome of this election, the prognostication is that when New Hampshire takes place, we might see Nikki Haley edge closer to Donald Trump, but he's still far and away the leader. And then, of course, there's South Carolina, her home state, after that. Not sure how she'll do there because Donald Trump is still a force to be reckoned with. Then, of course, there's Nevada. And then Super Tuesday. By that time, one would argue that Donald Trump will always be the clear front runner. And from that perspective, are these just fake primaries that we're seeing being lined up?
I love how you said that, fake primaries. You could call it that. It's really kind of a waste of Americans' time at this point. And I say that as somebody who loves to see a lot of options at the table. And I'm not really committed to any of the candidates on the Republican side, although I'll definitely cast my vote for a Republican. So I like seeing a younger generation and new thoughts and new leadership come into play. I'm looking for what America can be in the future, just not making America great again and looking backwards. So I've been excited by a lot of the debates and hearing what people have to say. The problem is, the reality is that Trump is just so incredibly dominant and has captured the hearts and minds of people and elevated their enthusiasm, and is seen as somebody who's willing to fight for the people who have no voice. That I think that's why you're seeing him outpoll Biden in just spades in critical swing states. So no matter what the case is that Haley and DeSantis make for, in a head-to-head, we hypothetically beat Biden, they can't get through a Republican primary because the Republican firewall is South Carolina. If you don't make it through South Carolina is really where candidates go to die, to win or lose, And New Hampshire has always been an outlier. In 2000, President George W. Bush, when he was governor, when he was running against John McCain, lost New Hampshire by 19 percentage points. And I've never seen more people send their resumes out to see if they thought we were going to lose. I remember where I was sitting right in Karl Rove's office, and we were watching the returns, and things were just falling apart. And there's this crisis moment, but New Hampshire has always been the outlier. So we tripled down on South Carolina, and that was our firewall, and everything falls into place after that.
You mentioned Karl Rove, and I was just thinking about him, our former colleague, yours, in terms of working at the White House with him, and mine
My
from my
boss, not my
former
colleague.
days.
I could never
Your
be an
boss.
equal.
The Karl Rove, the architect, has stated that he wants to see Donald Trump become more conciliatory and reaching out across the aisle and to every American, because he believes this is a time that we need to find our common ground, to get over race, get over politics, the things that divide us, and focus more on the things that unite us. From that perspective, what would that do in terms of fueling more hope for America?
Well, first of all, I don't think that's going to happen because Donald Trump hasn't had to strike a conciliatory tone. It doesn't actually work with his persona. So I would say that's a pipe dream. Carl's really, really smart, and I never want to contradict him. But I think in this case, I think he's standing up for what he and I both, and I'm sure you would love to see in our leader, which is to respect and honor one another and to speak about our fellow Americans as people who are worthy to have a seat at the table and are invited, even if we disagree, just like Lincoln did with his, team of rivals.
Yeah.
We want to have people with different ideas. The problem is, in this environment, most Americans aren't in a conciliatory mood. Most Americans are just barely able to survive. So when you have Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the baseline of food, shelter, just your basic needs, security, are not met, which is exactly what's happening to so many Americans, they're being left behind. They don't have the ability to descend in that hierarchy of needs to a place where they can love themselves and think about themselves as worthy of being loved. And therefore, as the Bible says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. If they can't get there, it's going to be impossible for them to extend that love to other people. And I think that's where the disconnect comes between Washington and the rest of America.
Denise, I always appreciate your analysis and your way of explaining things. I always have to ask you this: based on everything you just told me and all the politics that we've talked about, what's your hope for America?
I mean, my hope for America is, I'm sure what yours is. I'm sure we share this, but I also think so many Americans feel, even if they can't rally behind it, and you see it reflected in the polls. And that's that Americans recognize that unity is a non-negotiable. If you're a Christian, there's 179 verses in the Bible that talk about unity and how important that is to God. And so, if you're not a Christian, even if you don't believe in anything, the reality is clinging to relationships that are important and vital, that give you joy, just increase your happiness. It's really miserable being an angry partisan hack all the time. It's just not a sustainable way of life. And guess what? This election season is going to come and go. But at the end of the day, those people that you love, who love you, your friends, your neighbors, your family members, those most important relationships to your happiness, they're going to be there well after the election season and well after this president and the next and the next. And so my hope is that Americans will recognize that we are the hope for America, that whether or not we choose to embrace unity will determine whether we have a nation to defend and fight for in the future.
Denise Gsum, love you, my friend.
Same to
Keep
you.
hope burning.
So
Keep
good
it alive.
being with you.
All right.
Yes.
We'll
Thanks
do
for
this
fueling hope
again.
in America. You're the
All
best,
right.
Kelly.
Thanks, Denise. Back with
Take
more
care.
in just a moment. And welcome back to America's Hope. We're talking all things politics as it relates to the Republican campaign trail. And of course, President Joe Biden looking in and observing what his competition will look like as the year approaches for the presidential election. But joining me now is someone who knows politics extremely well, Timothy Allen Simon. He is so many things. He's the owner of TAS Task Strategies. He is also a former member of the cabinet for Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger when he served as governor of California. Timothy also serves in the capacity as chairman of the California African American Chamber of Commerce. And you also represent so many people in the energy sector of African Americans. Timothy, good of you to join us this hour. If I get any of the above wrong, please correct me.
No, you're good. We're good.
You are good too, my friend. You've done so much. I want to ask you about your observations of the Republican candidates in the wake of what took place in Iowa. Iowa, of course, doesn't mean that everything is going to go according to Trump's plan to become the front runner, remain the front runner, I should say, and to become the presumptive nominee for the Republican Party. But it sure does look that way with him winning so handedly with 51% in Iowa. Now it's on to New Hampshire.
Yeah, Kelly, thank you for having me on. And I will say that I think the outcome of the Iowa caucuses is pretty much indicative of what we're going to see for the rest of the primary cycle for the Republican Party. It is former President Donald Trump's to lose. It is his party. And what's different from 2016, which I think even substantiates stronger his ability to gain the nomination, is that he now has a real machine on the ground. He has boots on the ground, as he did in Iowa. I'm sure he will in New Hampshire. When we get to South Carolina, the question will become, will he Jeb Bush, former Governor Nikki Haley, former Ambassador Nikki Haley, in her own state? Will he beat her in her own state? And the polling data says that more than likely he will. And then here comes Governor Ron DeSantis. President Trump will more than likely beat him in Florida as well. So I think the runway is there for former President Trump to be the nominee. Of course, he has his legal challenges that will be of issue, but from all indications, it'll be another Donald Trump, Joe Biden showdown, this time Joe Biden being the incumbent, and which gives him a large degree of advantage in terms of media time and space and events that are occurring around the world and how he addresses them. Some real challenges there when we're looking at foreign policy, but for the most part, I think we see a Trump-Biden showdown in November.
You talked about foreign policy. Certainly, foreign policy is something that many people are concerned with as it relates to the war between Israel and Hamas, the Ukraine-Russia war, what's happening in Africa, and then even in the Middle East, where the Houthi rebels recently fired upon a shipping vessel, the Gibraltar Eagle, which is a U.S. shipping vessel. Fortunately, there were no injuries and no problem with the ship. It went ahead and continued to sail the Red Sea. But there is a problem that seems to be unfolding, and has President Biden kept a watchful eye on Iran, as well as other enemies or bad actors in those areas?
I think the answer is yes. President Biden has prided himself on foreign policy. That was his strength in the United States Senate, was his foreign policy chops. When the unfortunate incident of October 7th happened in Israel, President Biden remarked that he knew Golda Meir. And that's how far back he goes in Middle East policy. However, within the decisions that he's making, it is clearly causing fissures or divide within his own party, particularly on the issue of Israel and Ukraine, and within Congress. And in terms of the Democratic politics, there was a long-standing coalition between the Jewish community, the African American community, and this even goes back to the days when the Republican Party was the vanguard of civil rights. But there was always this coalition between Jews, African Americans, and labor. That coalition is running into trouble. And I think it's something that President Biden, Secretary Anthony Blinken, whenever Secretary Austin returns, but that's what they're going to have to deal with, is how we are managing our relationships with Israel and relationships to our relationships with other parts of the Middle East. I do think it's doable, but clearly the Netanyahu administration is taking a very aggressive stance. 22,000 estimated civilian deaths. I know that the health ministry is run by Hamas, but let's just reduce those numbers down. It's still a catastrophe. And I think it could very well cause certain young voters who have no recollection of that coalition, who have most of their adult lives have only dealt with the Netanyahu regime. I think there could be a low voter turnout on the Biden administration because of the way that the perception is this being handled. Then we move to Ukraine, and you have the same problem on the Republican side. And there are even those within Democratic circles who are saying the billions and billions of dollars that we want to send to Ukraine when there are such domestic needs, I think has the potential of sparking an isolationism even within Democratic circles in the United States. And again, for many of our younger voters, they're not familiar with hawkish Democrats. They came out of the endless wars of Afghanistan and Iraq, and people were tired. People were tired of the fatalities. And as you've stated, not only do we have the Houthis, we have issues in Northern Africa and other areas. I don't think there's necessary transparency on where our American women and men, our troops who serve our countries, are located. And I do think that President Biden is going to have a very frank Oval Office discussion with the American people on where his party and he stands on these various conflicts that we're being drawn into. And just in closing on that point, Kelly, when President Obama engaged the Iranian administration, for lack of a better term, or the Iranian regime into the nuclear talks, one of the objectives, as he said, was not isolating them, to make sure that we could maintain dialogue with Iran and address our issues in Syria, the Red Sea, Lebanon, all these areas where it appears that Iran is provoking an incident with the United States. Right now, we're relying on Qatar and other Middle Eastern states. I almost said Saudi Arabia, but they do not have a good relationship with Iran. So I think the president is going to have to come to the American people in the Ronald Reagan-esque fashion and really explain what is the purpose of these billions of dollars that he wants Congress to commit to these volatile areas.
This campaign that's going on right now, the politics that we find ourselves in as we approach the election of a new president in November, what are your concerns? What do you think the concerns are of the American people? We've talked about foreign policy. Now let's bring it home to domestic policy, immigration and economy and crime.
Well, in terms of immigration, we have to, it was President Ronald Reagan that said foreign policy begins with your neighbor. And our immigration issue is a foreign policy issue. We are at a period in our country that I've never experienced in my 68 years on earth, where we literally have a labor shortage. We have a manpower shortage in many of our industries, while at the same time, we can't develop an immigration policy that can better service our economy. So I think that there needs to be less racially driven dialogue, because many of these people coming across the border look more like you and me, and more talking about the power of migration. We hosted President Vicente Fox when I was in the Schwarzenegger administration, and that's what he talked about when we brought him to Sacramento, California, that we need to better leverage world migration in a way where we can direct people away from famine, away from political conflict, away from economic disasters, and take advantage of the needs that we have. Unfortunately, our border situation, which is at a crisis stage, I'm not going to sit back here and act like these thousands and thousands of people coming across the border illegally every day should not be of concern. But I do believe that there's opportunities there as well. In terms of the economy, and as you know, I'm a former California Public Utilities Commissioner. My firm works heavily in the energy industry. We need energy independence. Much of the conflicts that we're seeing around the world is a result of, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the Gaza, whether it's the Red Sea, much of it is generated by energy dependency, not just of the United States, but other nations around the world who relied upon Russia, for example, for natural gas. We have to assert our resources more. We have to invest more into the exporting of liquefied natural gas, along with promoting decarbonization by way of hydrogen and dairy gas and other areas, along with America's move to electrification. I do believe that there are economic benefits for our nation to do this, but I'm not in full agreement in how it's being implemented. I think taking away choice of people on their power source for the benefit of climate change when there are other alternative uses. As a regulator, you learn what is the least cost, best fit. And I do believe as we look into the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, you will find that there will be pockets of resistance, and that resistance is going to need to be addressed by the Department of Energy as well as Congress so we can work this out together. There has to be a balance. You're always going to have immigration, but I think we have to have a greater focus on how to get these young people and older people who are changing careers into the positions where there are demand.
Yeah, you're talking about workforce development, and that's a problem that has to be addressed. The solution has to be found on both sides of the aisle, the left and the right, Republican and Democrat. Of these candidates who are running for president and the current president, are they talking the right approach?
Each has its own side. I think President Biden has created somewhat of a new deal in infrastructure and energy. I can't even count the number of presidents that wanted an infrastructure act or some kind of infrastructure legislation to deal with our aged infrastructure. You know, there are countries that we fund in foreign aid that have better infrastructure than we do. So I think it was clearly high time for that. On the other side, I do think that the Republicans are addressing the issue that even though we have lower unemployment numbers, even though we have a strong GDP, inflation is making it where families are not feeling it. And of course, that involves the Federal Reserve and the monetary policies. But in truth, if President Biden wants to be reelected, he is going to have to find a way to curb interest rates and inflation by election time. It's kind of similar to when the trickle-down economy arguments of David Stockman under the Reagan administration. I think the Democrats did a very good job of saying trickle-down economics is not working for working people. Now the Republicans are doing a very good job in saying, yes, he's been able to address climate change. Yes, he's been able to address infrastructure. But are you feeling better as a family? Do you feel more economically secure? And from my evaluation, I think the answer is largely no. So the Democrats are going to have to do better messaging to tell people that the better days are yet to come.
That lays it out pretty well of what's ahead in this tumultuous political year. Timothy, my final question to you is, based on everything we've talked about, and we could delve into a lot more, so we'll have to have you back on. But for the moment, what is your hope for America?
My hope for America is that we can effectively address white supremacy and white nationalism, of political violence that's coming out of this country, that we can get people to begin to look and understand that we're all in this together. Regardless if you're right or left, we're all in this together. And we need our elected leaders as well as our business leaders to bring us together in what we share in common and then work out what we may differ in. And my concern is I'm not seeing enough voices in that area of commonality, because no matter how you feel about one race, one faith, one lifestyle, we have more in common than we have apart. And I think whatever party can convey that in terms of our future will be victorious party in terms of this nation. We are fractured in a way that I have not seen, and Kelly, you and I are old enough to remember the water hoses and the dogs in the South. I have not seen us this fractured in a long time, and we need more voices of commonality, reducing the escalation of emotions surrounding conflicts that we have domestically and internationally, and really try to find a way to work together. I know it sounds very kumbaya, but it is. I mean, that's really what we're talking about if we're going to survive as the leader of the free world.
Find that common ground and have a seat at the table of brotherhood and do some good. I hear you. Timothy Allen Simon, thank you for joining us. So welcome back to America's Hope. So as we look in the rearview mirror to the Iowa Republican caucuses, now we look ahead to what's unfolding in terms of New Hampshire and then South Carolina and ultimately Super Tuesday. And so it's a good time to talk to a pollster. Stefan Henen is the founder and president of Lincoln Park Strategies. And Stefan has nearly 2 decades of experience in market research, data analytics, communication strategy, and public opinion polling and analysis for clients that range from America's Promise to the City of Los Angeles to Raytheon to the Southern Environmental Law Center. You just do it all, man. And so did you look at the Iowa caucuses, and did you have some polling in place about what you saw as being the outcome?
Yeah, so we personally didn't have any polls going in Iowa, but, have access to the public polls that were coming out. And, in general, I mean, there were different variations of it, but most people had Donald Trump was going to win, and then the question was who was going to come in second and third. And now some surveys got it a little bit closer to the level of win, if we can call it that Trump ended up getting, where, and a few other surveys had a little bit closer than it ultimately ended up being. But in general, the polling had a pretty good night. Trump didn't lift a finger and still walked away with it. I think he won a majority in all but I think it was 10 counties out of the 99. So, I mean, it was just, he walloped everyone, and there's nothing in these results that say anything other than he's going to be the nominee, probably by early March, if not even before then.
Look, I've got to ask you, as we're looking at this polling, with regard to the Republican Party and the Republican presidential candidates, overall, in a general election, what would the former president face in terms of dealing with the current president, Joe Biden?
Yeah. So, and this is the big question. This is the thing we don't yet know and won't know for a while, right? So if you want to argue I'll call it the anti-Trump line, it's, look, yes, he won handily, but only with 51%. I'm going to put only in quotes. So 49% of Republican voters were looking for something else. Now, the question in the general election is how many of that 49% is not going to end up voting for whoever the Republican nominee is. And I think, now this is oversimplifying it, but I think generally DeSantis voters are going to move to Trump without much problem. And now the question is, for people voting for Haley or any of the, candidates who got like 5 votes, do all of them, what percent move to I'm just voting for Trump, I'm moving to the Republican nominee? And then how many are in the, no, I just cannot bring myself to vote for Trump. I'm either going to stay home or I will vote for President Biden over Trump because that's how much I dislike Trump, even though I'm a Republican. So, that's the difference, and that's what's ultimately going to decide November. And, the number of people who voted for Biden in 2020 and are now saying, nope, I'm going to now vote for Trump in 2024, is going to be a very small number, I would guess. And so now it's just a question of, what are those, and it's really those Haley supporters, where do they end up come October, November of this year?
That pretty much spells it out in terms of what we're looking at. And the polling, what does it indicate as the main priority for American people? Is it the economy? Is it immigration, crime, national security, or is it all of the above?
It's all of the above, and all depends, right? And now I should also caveat what I just said earlier. It's what are Haley-type voters going to do in 4 or 5 specific states, right? So what they do in Iowa is probably not really going to matter because Trump's going to win, or the Republican nominee, whoever it would be, is going to win Iowa without breaking much of a sweat. So it's going to come down to the usual suspects in terms of the swing states. And on the issues, again, it changes a little bit regionally and depending on the voter, but if you're going to shorthand it, it's going to be economy first and then whatever comes second. So, if the economy continues to do well and people are feeling that the economy is doing well, which has been Biden's big challenge up to date, is that even if the economic numbers are looking good and inflation's down, gas prices are down, wages are up, all those things, right? If people aren't feeling that it's good, it doesn't matter what those economic numbers are. Now, the numbers seem to be trending towards people catching up with where the economics are. So we'll have to see if that continues. And then how are people feeling post Labor Day? If people are feeling the economy is pretty good, I'm feeling that my family's in a good place, I'm in a good place, good for Biden. If people are feeling that the economy just isn't doing it for them, better for Trump.
Well, Stefan, as you know, a lot can happen between now and post Labor Day. So,
I mean, a lot can happen between now and next week. So
yeah. Well, look, I appreciate you bringing some polling data for us and keeping us updated. Come on back, because we'll have this conversation again and again until Election Day, and even after Election Day.
I am happy to come back anytime, and it's certainly going to be an interesting year.
All right, Stefan Henen joining us tonight, founder and president of Lincoln Park Strategies. Thank you so much, Stefan.
Thanks for having me.
All right, back with more in just a moment. And welcome back to America's Hope. I'd like to thank all of our guests who appeared on tonight's program. And now for my final word. The big question is next. Next up is New Hampshire, taking place next week, January 23rd. The New Hampshire primary, the Granite State. Nikki Haley has the endorsement from the governor of that state, but how will that hold up to people who are diehard Trump supporters? And will Ron DeSantis be able to do anything to topple either of the two? The question can only be answered by the voters when they show up. In the meantime, keep hope alive in America. Keep on hoping for great outcomes for the goodness of this nation. God bless America. Good night.